In the 21st year of Ramesses III's reign, a woman named Ta stood before the royal court. What she had done was so dangerous that the scribes recording the trial refused to write the full details, using only euphemisms and symbols. But what she was about to face was worse than any death the court had ever imposed. It was a punishment so complete, so terrifying, that even speaking about it was believed to invite the same fate. The other conspirators would burn. Their bodies would be destroyed, their souls prevented from entering the afterlife. But Ta? She would experience something the Egyptians feared more than physical torture, more than being devoured alive, more than any pain that could be inflicted on flesh. She would undergo the ritual that priests only referred to as the second death, though even that name didn't capture the full horror of what was coming. You see, the ancient Egyptians had discovered something about human existence that we've tried to forget. They knew there were things worse than dying, states of being more terrifying than non-existence. Punishments that didn't just end life, but corrupted it so fundamentally that, well, the hieroglyphs themselves seem to resist being translated, as if the language itself recoils from describing what they did. In the papyrus records, there are gaps. Deliberate omissions, where scribes simply wrote, "The unspeakable was performed," or "What cannot be written occurred here." Witnesses to certain punishments were made to undergo purification rituals afterward, not because they had seen death. Egyptians were familiar with death, but because they had seen something that contaminated anyone who observed it. Tonight, you're going to discover why archaeologists finding certain burial sites immediately sealed them back up, why some hieroglyphic texts have been deliberately mistranslated for public consumption, why the Romans, who crucified thousands and fed criminals to lions for entertainment, wrote letters home describing Egyptian punishments as beyond the boundaries of what mortals should know. There were the public executions everyone knows about. Then there were the other ones, the ceremonies performed in sealed chambers where the screaming wasn't from pain but from something worse, where victims begged not for death but for the mercy of being allowed to die normally, where what happened to the body was secondary to what happened to the other parts of a person. The sacred lakes, where certain rituals took place, are still avoided by locals today, 3,000 years later. Not because of superstition, but because of genetic memory, inherited terror, passed down through generations who knew that some places had witnessed things that should never have existed. What you're about to hear includes punishments so disturbing that Egyptian priests themselves, men who routinely mummified corpses and performed human sacrifices, required months of preparation before they could administer them. Rituals that transformed criminals into something that couldn't be called alive, but couldn't be called dead either. States of existence that Egyptian theology had words for, but we don't, because our language never needed to describe such possibilities. There were the women who faced public humiliations so complete that their own children would refuse to acknowledge they had ever been born from human mothers. The men who underwent transformations that made them unrecognizable as ever having been male or human. The families who were subjected to collective punishments that bound them together in ways that, let's just say, Egyptian priests understood things about consciousness and identity that we're only beginning to rediscover. Some punishments involve sacred animals, but not in the way you might think. Not simple death by crocodile or trampling by bulls. No, the Egyptians had learned to use animals as instruments for things that went beyond killing. Rituals where the boundary between human and animal, between criminal and sacrifice, between punishment and transformation, became meaningless. And then there were the children, the ones born into punishment, the ones who existed in states that Egyptian law struggled to classify, not alive enough to be citizens, not dead enough to be buried, the ones kept in temple basements where priests documented processes that took years to complete. But perhaps most terrifying were the punishments that appeared merciful, The criminals who were simply told to drink a cup of wine and go to sleep, who were given comfortable rooms and good food, who were treated with kindness even as something was happening to them that made observers weep with horror. Because the Egyptians had discovered that the worst torments didn't always involve pain. The records are all there, in the papyri, in the stone inscriptions, in the archaeological evidence that museums keep in restricted collections. The proof of what human beings are capable of when they convince themselves that certain horrors are necessary for cosmic order, when suffering becomes sacred, when punishment transcends into something that shouldn't exist but did. So prepare yourself, because you're about to discover why ancient Egypt was feared not for its armies or its magic, but for its justice system. Why criminals would kill themselves in the most painful ways possible rather than face Egyptian judgment. Why certain punishments were considered contagious, not the physical wounds, but the knowledge of what had been done. The ancient Egyptians understood something we've desperately tried to forget, that there are places human cruelty can go that shouldn't be possible. Destinations of suffering that once discovered can never be fully forgotten. They found those places. They mapped them, they perfected them, and they used them for 3,000 years. What follows is the complete truth about punishments so extreme that even describing them fully would be considered dangerous. Methods that didn't just kill, but did something else. Something that the human mind instinctively knows is wrong, but can't quite articulate why. These weren't random barbarities, but carefully designed experiences that revealed the ancient Egyptians had discovered things about human consciousness, identity, and suffering that we pretend are impossible. But the evidence is overwhelming. The records, though censored and euphemistic, are clear. They did these things. They made them normal. They convinced entire populations that horrors beyond description were not just acceptable but necessary. And somewhere, deep in our collective memory, we remember. That's why certain Egyptian artifacts make people unconsciously step back, why certain hieroglyphs seem to carry a weight beyond their meaning, why certain archaeological sites have an atmosphere that modern instruments can't measure but human instinct recognizes. Because the ancient Egyptians didn't just punish criminals. They discovered the absolute boundaries of what could be done to a human being while they were still technically alive. And then they went further. Before diving into these forgotten stories, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The sacred lake at the Temple of Sobek in Fayum was perfectly still in the midday heat of 1350 BC, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple that might have been wind, but probably wasn't. Beneath those deceptively calm waters lived over 100 Nile crocodiles, each one considered a living manifestation of Sobek, the crocodile god who represented both royal power and primal chaos. These weren't just animals, they were divine instruments of justice, and today they would feed on human transgression. The condemned man's name was Khayyam Wasset, though by the time he reached the lake's edge, that name had already been struck from the initial records. His crime had been sacrilege of the highest order. He had been caught stealing gold from the inner sanctuary of the temple, gold that had been touching the god's own statue. In Egyptian theology, this wasn't just theft. It was an attack on the divine order of the universe itself, and it required a punishment that would both destroy the criminal and appease the offended deity. The preparation for crocodile execution began days before the actual feeding. Khayyam Wasset had been kept in a cell beneath the temple, where priests would visit him not to offer comfort, but to perform rituals that would mark him as an offering to Sobek. His body was painted with symbols that identified him as sacrificial meat rather than human. The hieroglyphs drawn on his skin literally translated to "food for the gods' children," stripping away his human identity and reclassifying him as a consumable offering. He was fed a special diet that the crocodiles were known to prefer, fish that had been left to partially decay, creating a scent that would attract the predators more quickly. His flesh was literally being seasoned for consumption. Most disturbing, he was forced to drink water from the sacred lake itself, water that contained the saliva and waste of the crocodiles that would soon devour him. This created a biological connection between predator and prey before they ever met, a ritual pollution that marked him as belonging to the crocodiles even while he still breathed. The crowd that gathered for crocodile executions was different from those at other punishments. These were primarily temple devotees, people who saw the feeding not as execution but as religious ceremony. They brought offerings for Sobek, fish, fowl, and golden amulets shaped like crocodiles. Children were lifted onto shoulders to witness what their parents called the God's Feast, normalizing the sight of human consumption as divine will. Vendors sold special viewing positions, with the closest spots reserved for wealthy patrons who wanted to see every detail of divine justice. The priests of Sobek were specialists in reading crocodile behavior, and they had developed an entire theology around how the animals consumed their victims. A quick death meant the criminal's soul would be destroyed instantly, a mercy of sorts. But if the crocodiles played with their food, dragging it under and releasing it repeatedly, this was interpreted as Sobek himself extending the punishment into the spiritual realm. The worst outcome was if the crocodiles refused to eat the condemned entirely, leaving them to drown slowly while being ignored by the gods' avatars. This meant even Sobek found them too corrupt to consume. The platform from which criminals were fed to crocodiles was an architectural marvel designed for maximum theatrical and religious impact. It extended 20 feet over the water, allowing the crowd clear views while keeping them safe from the sacred predators. The platform could be raised or lowered using a complex system of counterweights, allowing priests to control the exact timing and manner of the criminal's delivery to the crocodiles. Kamwaset was brought to the platform naked except for a loincloth that bore Sobek's symbol even in death. He was marked as the god's property. His arms were bound, but his legs were left free. The thrashing was considered part of the offering, the movement attracting the crocodiles and demonstrating the criminal's futile struggle against divine justice. The priests began their chants, ancient words in the old language that supposedly translated the criminal's screams into prayers that Sobek could understand. The water below began to stir as the crocodiles sensed the disturbance above. These weren't wild animals, but sacred beasts that had been fed on schedule for generations. They knew that when the platform lowered and the chanting began, food was coming. The largest males would position themselves directly beneath, while smaller crocodiles circled the periphery, waiting for scraps that might float away from the main feeding. As Kamwaset was lowered, the water around the platform began to churn with scaled bodies. The priests had made small cuts on his legs, not deep enough to be fatal but sufficient to release blood into the water. The effect was immediate. What had been lazy circling became focused attention. The largest crocodile, a massive bull the priests called Sobek's first tooth, approached the platform. This ancient creature was over 15 feet long, scarred from decades of feeding on the condemned. What happened next was recorded by a Greek merchant named Heliodorus, who had the misfortune of witnessing an execution during his travels. He described the sound as the worst part, not the screaming, which ended quickly, but the crushing noise as crocodile jaws compressed bones. A sound, he said, resembled trees being splintered by lightning. The water turned red, then pink, then red again as different crocodiles took their portions. The entire feeding lasted less than 3 minutes, but Heliodorus claimed those minutes felt like hours. But the crocodile execution didn't end with death. The priests would spend the next days watching the sacred lake, looking for signs of Kamwaset's remains. Crocodiles don't digest bones well, and these would eventually be expelled. The priests would collect these remains, but not for burial. Instead, They would be ground into powder and mixed into the mud used to make bricks for the temple. The criminal's very bones would become part of the structure that housed the god he had offended, serving in death the divinity he had robbed in life. The theological implications of crocodile execution went beyond simple death. Egyptians believed that the body needed to be intact for resurrection in the afterlife. Being dismembered and digested by sacred animals didn't just kill, it made resurrection impossible. The soul would arrive in the afterlife, in pieces, unable to reform, condemned to exist in a state of eternal dissolution. This wasn't just capital punishment. It was spiritual annihilation delivered through divine digestion. Some variations of crocodile execution were even more elaborate. For crimes that involved multiple offenders, group feedings would be orchestrated. Families who had conspired together would be fed to the crocodiles in sequence, forced to watch their relatives consumed before facing their own turn. The order mattered. Children first to maximize parental anguish, then women, then men. The psychological torture of watching your family devoured while knowing your turn approached was considered part of the divine justice. One particularly horrific case involved a family of tomb robbers caught desecrating a royal burial. The father, mother, and 3 children were all condemned to crocodile execution. But rather than feeding them all at once, the priests orchestrated a 3-day ceremony. Each day at noon, one family member would be lowered to the crocodiles, while the others were forced to watch from cages suspended above the water. By the 3rd day, the surviving members had watched their entire family consumed piece by piece, knowing exactly what awaited them. The economic aspect of crocodile execution reveals the cold calculation behind the spectacle. The Temple of Sobek charged admission for prime viewing spots during executions. Wealthy patrons could pay for the privilege of throwing meat to the crocodiles after the human feeding, associating themselves with divine justice. The temple sold amulets supposedly made from crocodile teeth that had touched criminal flesh, marketed as protection against theft and sacrilege. The execution of criminals became a revenue stream that funded temple operations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of crocodile execution was its unpredictability. Sometimes the crocodiles, for reasons known only to them, would refuse to eat certain criminals. These condemned would float in the sacred lake, slowly drowning while surrounded by predators that ignored them. The priests interpreted this as Sobek himself rejecting the offering, declaring the criminal too polluted even for divine consumption. One such case involved a priestess named Amanirdis, who had been condemned for violating her vows of purity. When the crocodiles refused to touch her despite 3 attempts at feeding, the priests declared that Sobek had marked her for special punishment. She was buried alive in the desert, but not in a tomb, in a shallow pit where she would die slowly from exposure while desert scavengers could reach her, but she couldn't escape. The crocodile's rejection had condemned her to a death that would take days instead of minutes. In the temple of Isis at Philae, a priest named Amenhotep stood trial for the ultimate betrayal of his sacred vows. He had been discovered in the inner sanctum with a virgin priestess, violating not just temple law, but the cosmic order itself. His punishment would be more than death. It would be the complete destruction of his masculine identity, both in this world and the next. The knife that would remove his manhood had been heating in sacred flames for hours, the bronze blade inscribed with curses that would follow him into the afterlife. Castration in ancient Egypt wasn't simply physical mutilation. It was theological annihilation of masculine essence. Egyptians believed that the body needed to be complete for resurrection in the afterlife. A man without his genitals couldn't father children in the eternal realm, couldn't achieve unity with goddess consorts, couldn't even stand properly before Osiris for judgment. The removal of manhood was a punishment that echoed through eternity. The practice of castration as punishment was documented as early as the Middle Kingdom, but it reached its most elaborate forms during the New Kingdom when the theology of bodily integrity had been fully developed. The procedure itself was ritualized. performed not by common executioners, but by specialist priests, who understood both the physical and spiritual implications of what they were removing. Amenhotep's castration would be public, performed in the temple courtyard where his crime had been committed. The audience would include other priests, forced to witness what happened to those who violated sacred law. The virgin priestesses would be present, seated in a special viewing area, their presence a reminder of what Amenhotep had tried to defile. Even the common people could attend, though they had to undergo purification rituals before entering the sacred space. The preparation for castration began with forced fasting. For 3 days, Amenhotep consumed only water, mixed with bitter herbs that would thin his blood and supposedly concentrate his masculine essence in his genitals. This wasn't mercy. It was believed to make the removal more spiritually complete. On the final night, he was forced to drink a mixture containing blue lotus extract, which would prevent him from losing consciousness during the procedure, while also causing hallucinations that priests interpreted as his masculine soul preparing to depart. The actual procedure was precisely choreographed. Amenhotep was bound to a stone altar, his body positioned so everyone could witness his transformation from man to something else. The knife used was specific to castration punishments, a curved blade that had been used for generations, its metal supposedly containing the masculine essence of every man it had unmanned. The priest performing the castration wore a mask of Thoth, the god of judgment, transforming the mutilation into divine verdict. The first cut removed the testicles, the source of masculine power. These would be burned immediately in a brazier containing incense and natron, the smoke carrying Amenhotep's virility to the gods as an offering. The second cut, more difficult and dangerous, removed the penis itself. This would not be burned but preserved in salt and displayed in the temple as a warning to other priests who might consider similar violations. But the castration was just the beginning of Amenhotep's punishment. He would survive the procedure. The priests were skilled enough to prevent him from bleeding to death. He would be kept in the temple as a living reminder of divine justice, neither man nor woman, neither priest nor commoner. He would be forced to serve the very virgin priestesses he had tried to violate, but now as something that wasn't quite human, referred to only in neutral terms, his name replaced with a designation that meant the cut one. The variations of genital mutilation went beyond simple castration. For rapists, the punishment might include the removal of the penis while leaving the testicles intact, creating a torture of desire without ability. For adulterers, sometimes only one testicle would be removed, leaving the man technically capable, but marked forever as a violator. Each variation carried different theological implications for the afterlife. Herodotus, writing about Egyptian customs, described witnessing a mass castration of defeated enemies after a battle. Hundreds of men were systematically unmanned, their removed organs collected and counted as trophies of war. But this wasn't simple humiliation of the defeated. Each set of genitals was inscribed with the owner's name and buried in cursed ground, ensuring that even if the man's body was properly mummified, he would arrive incomplete in the afterlife. The economic implications of castration as punishment created a disturbing industry. Eunuchs, once castrated as punishment, became valuable as guards for harems and tombs. They couldn't produce heirs to challenge succession, couldn't violate women, and were believed to be more loyal because they had no family lines to protect. Some criminals would actually request castration over death, knowing they could find employment as eunuchs rather than face execution. Women faced their own versions of genital mutilation as punishment, though these were less commonly documented. Adulteresses might have their external genitalia removed or scarred, marking them as violated and preventing them from experiencing physical pleasure. Temple virgins who broke their vows might undergo procedures that would make intercourse impossible, forcing them to maintain physical virginity even after their spiritual virginity was lost. The tools used for genital mutilation were kept in special temple chambers, treated as sacred objects. They were regularly purified with natron and holy water, inscribed with prayers and curses. Some were made from meteoric iron, believed to carry divine power from the heavens. The priests who wielded these tools underwent special training, learning not just the physical techniques, but the proper prayers and rituals that transformed mutilation into divine judgment. One particularly elaborate case involved a nobleman named Waset, who had assaulted the wife of a higher-ranking official. His punishment combined castration with other mutilations in a ceremony that lasted hours. First, his penis was removed and burned. Then his testicles were crushed rather than cut, a process that took 30 precise blows with a ritual hammer. His nipples were then removed, eliminating all external signs of gender. Finally, his tongue was split, preventing him from speaking clearly about what he had been. He survived all of this, living another 20 years as a warning to others. Fire held a unique horror in Egyptian punishment, because it didn't just kill, it prevented resurrection. In a culture obsessed with preserving the body for the afterlife, burning was the ultimate annihilation. The judicial papyrus of Turin preserves the records of the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, where the conspirators faced this most terrible of fates. But the burning wasn't simple immolation. It was a carefully orchestrated ceremony designed to destroy not just flesh, but the very possibility of eternal existence. Queen Tiye, the secondary wife who orchestrated the conspiracy, watched as her co-conspirators were prepared for burning. The preparation took days, involving rituals that would ensure complete spiritual annihilation. The condemned were force-fed substances that would make their bodies burn hotter and more completely. Oils that had been cursed by priests, resins that would ensure no recognizable remains survived, chemicals that would turn even bones to ash. The location for burning executions was carefully chosen. It couldn't be on sacred ground, which would be polluted by the destruction of human souls. It couldn't be near water, where the ashes might contaminate sources of purification. The burning grounds were typically in the desert, far from settlements, in places already considered cursed. The ground itself would be prepared with salt and natron, creating a barrier that would prevent the destroyed souls from escaping into the earth. The actual burning platform was an architectural statement about the totality of the punishment. Built from stones taken from destroyed temples and failed monuments, it was a structure made from failure and defeat. The platform was designed with channels that would direct the melting fat and bodily fluids into collection pools, where they would be mixed with sand to create a substance that would be used to seal tombs, the destroyed bodies literally becoming barriers that trapped other souls. The condemned were brought to the burning ground in a procession that inverted normal funeral rites. Instead of mourners, there were cursers who spoke damnation upon the criminals. Instead of offerings for the afterlife, there were items that would burn with them and trap their souls in the flames, false gold that would melt and bind their spirits, written curses that would become smoke and follow them into non-existence, images of their families that would ensure their bloodlines were cursed. The fire itself wasn't ordinary flame, but a specially prepared conflagration that combined practical and magical elements. The base fuel was wood from trees that had been struck by lightning, considered already touched by divine wrath. Added to this were the mummies of animals that had died of disease, their corrupted preservation adding to the spiritual pollution of the flames. Most disturbing were the additions of human elements, hair from executed criminals, fat rendered from previous burnings, creating a fire that was generationally cursed. As the conspirators were brought to the platform, they were arranged in specific positions that held theological significance. Those who had used magic in their conspiracy were positioned facing east, where the sun god Ra would witness their destruction at dawn. Those who had used poison were positioned facing west, where they would be consumed as the sun died. The positioning created a human sundial of suffering, with the shadows of the burning bodies marking the passage of time and the completeness of their annihilation. The lighting of the fire was ceremonial. It couldn't be done with common flame, but required pure fire, created by focusing sunlight through crystal lenses. This process could take hours, during which the condemned stood on the platform, coated in oils, knowing that when the sun reached the right angle, their destruction would begin. The psychological torture of waiting for the sun to position itself correctly, knowing that the same divine light that gave life to Egypt would bring their final death, was considered part of the punishment. When the flames finally caught, witnesses reported that the screaming could be heard for miles across the desert. But the priests conducting the execution didn't see this as mere death cries. They interpreted the screams as the sound of souls being torn apart. They would document the different tones and pitches, believing that each change in scream represented a different part of the soul being destroyed. The Ka, the Ba, the Ak, each spiritual component had its own sound of annihilation. The burning process was managed to ensure complete destruction. Priests would use long poles to reposition bodies that weren't burning evenly, ensuring that every part was consumed. They would add accelerants to areas that were resisting the flames. The goal wasn't just death, but complete obliteration. Not even teeth or bone fragments should remain identifiable. The process could take an entire day, with priests working in shifts to maintain the destruction. But even after the bodies were reduced to ash, the punishment continued. The ashes couldn't simply be scattered. They had to be disposed of in ways that ensured the soul couldn't reform. Some were mixed with pig fat and used to waterproof boats that carried criminals, the destroyed souls forever serving, to transport other condemned. Some were mixed into the feed of sacred animals, the souls being digested by divine beasts. Most horrifically, some were mixed into the mortar used to seal tombs, the destroyed souls becoming eternal barriers, preventing other dead from escaping their burials. The families of those burned faced their own punishments. They were forbidden from mourning, as mourning might call the destroyed soul back from non-existence. They had to publicly celebrate the destruction of their relatives, holding feasts where they thanked the gods for removing corruption from their bloodline. Children of the burned were marked with brands that identified them as offspring of the annihilated, carrying their parents' non-existence as a visible mark. The tomb complex at Abydos held a secret more terrible than any curse. In the burial chamber of King Jer of the First Dynasty, archaeologists found the remains of 318 individuals, all young women between the ages of 15 and 25, all having died at exactly the same time. These weren't victims of disease or war. They were retainer sacrifices, servants buried alive with their king to serve him in the afterlife. But the evidence suggests not all went willingly into the dark. The practice of burying servants with deceased royalty was presented as an honor, but the reality was a sophisticated system of coercion and control. Young women, usually from poor families, would be selected as children to serve in the royal household. They would be told from the earliest age that their destiny was to accompany their master into eternity. By the time the king died, these servants had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that many genuinely believed they were privileged to die for their master. But belief and willingness were two different things when facing the reality of being sealed in a tomb. The archaeological evidence tells a darker story. Many of the skeletons show signs of struggle, broken fingernails from clawing at walls, fractured bones from trying to escape, positioning that suggests some were held down while others were sealed in. The honor of eternal service came with very real terror when the tomb doors began to close. The preparation for retainer sacrifice began the moment the king showed signs of declining health. The selected servants would be moved to special quarters where they underwent purification rituals. They were fed foods that would preserve their bodies after death, high-salt diets that would begin the mummification process while they still lived. They were given increasing doses of lotus wine and poppy extracts, substances that would make them compliant and confused when the time came. The actual burial process was carefully orchestrated to minimize resistance. The servants would be led into the tomb in small groups, each told they were performing preparatory rituals. They would be given wine heavily laced with sedatives, enough to make them drowsy but not unconscious. The Egyptians believed the servants needed to be aware during their transition to eternal service. By the time they realized they were being sealed in, the drugs and darkness would have made effective resistance impossible. The tomb chambers where servants were buried alive were designed with cruel efficiency. They were large enough to hold multiple people, but too small to stand upright, forcing the victims into cramped positions that would become their eternal pose. Air shafts were included, but these were designed to be sealed after a specific time, ensuring the servants died slowly enough to properly transition to the afterlife, but not so slowly that decomposition would begin before death. Some tombs included even more elaborate cruelties. Servants might be chained to specific positions that mimicked their living duties, cupbearers kneeling with arms extended, fan bearers standing with arms raised, musicians positioned with their instruments. They would die in these poses, their bodies becoming eternal sculptures of servitude. The chains were made of gold and silver, precious enough to mark their importance, but still chains that ensured they couldn't escape their final duty. The psychological torture of living entombment extended beyond the immediate victims. Other servants would be forced to participate in sealing their colleagues in tombs, knowing that their turn might come with the next royal death. They would have to smile and sing hymns while closing doors on people they had lived and worked alongside for years. This shared complicity created a culture of normalized horror within royal households. Not all burial punishments involved royal tombs. Common criminals might be buried alive in the desert as a form of execution that avoided spilling blood on sacred ground. These burials were shallow, just deep enough that the victim couldn't escape, but shallow enough that desert scavengers could smell them. The condemned would die from a combination of suffocation, heat, and possibly being eaten alive by creatures that could dig down to reach them. One particularly horrific variation was the false tomb punishment. Criminals would be sealed in structures that resembled proper tombs, but were designed to mock proper burial. The walls would be painted with inverted hieroglyphs that cursed rather than blessed. The grave goods would be broken or corrupted items that would be useless in the afterlife. The victim would die surrounded by reminders that they were being buried, but denied proper burial, condemned to an afterlife of confusion and want. The economics of burial punishment created disturbing incentives. Families could sometimes pay to have sedatives added to the wine given to retainer sacrifices, ensuring their daughters died peacefully. They could bribe priests to position their children in better areas of the tomb, closer to air shafts, or in more comfortable positions. The corruption around these practices meant that the poor suffered most, their children dying in terror while wealthy families could purchase small mercies. In ancient Egypt, the face was more than flesh. It was identity itself. The systematic mutilation of facial features as punishment wasn't just physical torture, but the destruction of personhood that would persist into the afterlife. The removal of noses, ears, lips, and eyes followed specific protocols that transformed criminals into living warnings, while ensuring they would be unrecognizable to the gods in the afterlife. The practice of rhinotomy, nose removal, was the most common facial mutilation. A woman named Nefertiti, not the famous queen, but a common adulteress from Thebes, faced this punishment after being caught with a married priest. The removal of her nose served multiple purposes. It marked her as a criminal for life. It destroyed her beauty and marriageability. And most importantly, it would prevent her from breathing properly in the afterlife, the nose being essential for receiving the breath of life from the gods. The procedure was performed in public, usually in the market square where the crime's impact on social order could be addressed through visible justice. Nefertiti was bound to a post, her head secured in a wooden frame that prevented movement. The executioner used a specialized bronze blade, curved and sharp enough to remove the nose in a single motion. The crowd was required to watch. Turning away from justice was considered complicity with crime. But the removal was just the beginning. The wound would be treated with a caustic mixture of salt and vinegar that prevented healing and ensured severe scarring. No medical treatment was allowed. Attempting to help someone who had been mutilated was a crime itself. Nefertiti would spend the rest of her life with a gaping hole in the center of her face, immediately identifiable as someone who had violated sacred law. Ear removal carried different implications. Ears were associated with wisdom and obedience. Someone who wouldn't listen to law didn't deserve to hear at all. A scribe named Thutmose, who had been caught forging royal documents, had both ears removed in a ceremony that symbolically and literally cut him off from society. Without ears, he couldn't hear prayers, couldn't receive instructions, couldn't participate in verbal contracts. He became socially dead, even while physically alive. The mutilation of lips was reserved for those who had committed crimes of speech, blasphemers, false witnesses, and those who had spoken curses against the pharaoh. The lips would be cut away, leaving teeth permanently exposed in a skull-like grin. This not only made speech difficult, but also made eating and drinking a constant struggle. More importantly, in the afterlife, without lips to speak the proper prayers, the soul would be unable to defend itself during divine judgment. Eye removal, though less common, was perhaps the most theologically significant mutilation. Eyes were the windows to the soul and the means by which the dead would see their way through the underworld. A tomb robber named Paneb had his eyes burned out with hot bronze rods after being caught desecrating a royal burial. Blind in life, he would also be blind in death, unable to read the spiritual texts that would guide him through the afterlife, condemned to eternal darkness and confusion. The combinations of mutilations created hierarchies of punishment. A person might lose their nose for adultery, then their ears for repeating the offense, then their lips for lying about it. Each mutilation added another layer of social death and spiritual handicap. By the time all facial features were removed, the person was essentially erased, unrecognizable as human, unable to function in society, and spiritually crippled for eternity. The tools used for mutilation were treated as sacred objects. They were kept in temple storage, purified before each use, and inscribed with curses that would follow the mutilated into the afterlife. Some were made from meteoric iron, believed to carry divine judgment from the heavens. The executioners who wielded these tools were specially trained, understanding not just the physical technique, but the spiritual implications of each cut. Children of the mutilated faced their own stigma. They were marked as offspring of the disfigured, often prevented from entering temples or holding certain positions. Some communities required them to wear special clothing that identified them as children of the mutilated. The sins of the parents were literally written on their faces through inherited shame. The copper mines of Sinai weren't just places of hard labor. They were carefully designed hells on earth where condemned criminals were sent to die slowly through a combination of exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. But death was not the goal. The goal was maximum extraction of labor before inevitable death. The Romans would later adopt and refine this practice with their policy of damnatio ad metalla, but the Egyptians had perfected the art of working humans to death 1,000 years earlier. A man named Amenemheb, convicted of stealing from a temple construction site, was sentenced to the mines in the 15th year of Thutmose III's reign. His journey to the mines was itself part of the punishment. Chained in a coffle with dozens of other condemned, he walked for 2 weeks across increasingly hostile desert. No shelter was provided at night. Food was minimal, just enough to keep them moving. By the time they reached the mines, many were already half dead. The entrance to the mines was marked by monuments to futility, pyramids built from the bones of previous workers, mixed with mining slag to create structures that were both warning and promise of what awaited. New arrivals would be forced to add a bone from someone who had died during the march, contributing to the monument that would eventually contain their own remains. The living conditions in the mining camps were calculated for maximum suffering while maintaining minimum productivity. Workers slept in pits dug into the ground, covered with worn reed mats that provided no protection from the desert's temperature extremes. During summer, the pits became ovens. During winter, they were freezing tombs. Workers would huddle together for warmth, but this also meant that diseases spread rapidly through the camps. The work itself was designed to break bodies and spirits simultaneously. Copper ore had to be extracted from narrow shafts that required workers to contort their bodies into painful positions for hours. The air in the shafts was thick with dust that destroyed lungs within months. The temperature deep in the mines could exceed 120 degrees. Workers were given just enough water to prevent immediate death from dehydration, but not enough to maintain health. The daily routine was relentless. Workers would enter the mines before dawn and wouldn't emerge until after dark, meaning some went weeks without seeing sunlight. They worked in shifts that were deliberately designed to prevent proper sleep. Just as exhaustion was reaching its peak, workers would be rotated to a different task that used different muscles, ensuring that no part of the body ever recovered. The food provided was precisely calculated to be just above starvation level. Bread made from the coarsest grain, often mixed with sand that wore down teeth, onions that were usually rotting, water that was brackish and barely drinkable. Once a week, they might receive a small portion of dried fish, more salt than sustenance. This diet ensured that workers slowly starved while still being able to perform labor. The psychological torture of the mines went beyond physical suffering. Workers were forbidden from speaking except to report problems with equipment. Singing was punished with beating. Any sign of solidarity between workers was met with separation or worse. The goal was to reduce humans to silent, suffering machines that produced copper until they broke. Medical treatment in the mines was non-existent. Injuries were common: crushed fingers from rock falls, torn muscles from the constant lifting, respiratory diseases from the dust. Injured workers who couldn't meet their quotas were given even less food, accelerating their decline. The calculation was simple. It was cheaper to work someone to death and replace them than to allow recovery time. The average life expectancy in the mines was 18 months, but some survived longer through terrible means. There were rumors of cannibalism, of workers who prolonged their lives by consuming those who died. Whether true or not, the guards did nothing to discourage these rumors, as they added another layer of horror to the punishment. Amenemheb lasted 13 months. The records, kept with bureaucratic precision, show his declining productivity week by week. His final entry simply states, "No longer productive, discarded." His body would have been thrown into one of the mass pits that dotted the mining area. No burial rites, no preservation for the afterlife, just another piece of exhausted human equipment that had served its purpose. The judicial papyrus of Turin preserves one of the most detailed accounts of elite punishment in Egyptian history. The harem conspiracy against Ramesses III involved queens, princes, generals, and high officials in a plot that nearly succeeded in assassinating the god-king himself. But their punishment would be more complex than simple execution. It would involve forced suicide, a punishment that combined the shame of self-destruction with the theological implications of dying by one's own hand. Queen Tiye, the secondary wife who orchestrated the conspiracy to place her son Pentaur on the throne, faced a form of justice reserved for those whose status made public execution politically complicated. She was given a choice that wasn't really a choice: drink poison in private or be burned alive in public. The poison offered was a sophisticated mixture that Egyptian chemists had perfected over centuries, quick enough to be certain, slow enough to be agonizing. The preparation for forced suicide among the elite was ritualistic. The condemned would be confined to a chamber in their own palace, surrounded by the luxury they were about to lose forever. They would be given 3 days to settle their affairs. though everything they owned had already been confiscated. These 3 days were psychological torture, time to contemplate what they had lost, what they were about to lose, and the eternal ramifications of their chosen method of death. The poison provided to Queen Tie was presented in a golden cup, a final mockery of her royal status. The mixture included hemlock for paralysis, aconite for heart failure, and blue lotus extract to ensure she remained conscious through most of the dying process. She would be able to feel her body shutting down system by system, while her mind remained alert to experience it all. Prince Pentaur, her son, faced an even more complex forced suicide. As potential heir to the throne, his death had to be both certain and symbolically meaningful. He was provided with a specially prepared rope made from papyrus fibers, the same material used for sacred texts, now repurposed for his destruction. He would hang himself, but the positioning was specific. He had to do it in a room where his father's image could watch, making the pharaoh witness to his own son's shameful death. The other conspirators faced varied forms of forced suicide based on their ranks and roles. The generals who had promised military support were given their own swords and told to fall on them in the Roman fashion, a death that acknowledged their warrior status while ensuring they died by their own weapons. The scribes who had forged documents were given reed pens, sharpened to points, and instructed to open their own veins, dying by the instruments of their crimes. The judges who presided over the trials faced their own moral complexities. Some, finding the evidence insufficient or the punishments excessive, were themselves accused of corruption and faced the same forced suicides they had just mandated. The message was clear. In matters of royal security, there was no neutrality. You were either completely loyal or completely condemned. The theological implications of forced suicide were severe. Egyptians believed that the manner of death affected the soul's journey through the afterlife. Suicide was considered a form of self-murder that confused the spiritual essence. The Ka wouldn't know whether to treat the death as natural or violent. The Ba would be trapped between worlds, unable to properly separate from the body. The Akh would be denied its transformation into an effective spirit. Of all the punishments in ancient Egypt's arsenal, none was feared more than damnatio memoria, the complete erasure of a person's name and memory from history. This wasn't just death, it was retroactive non-existence, the denial that a person had ever lived at all. In a culture that believed speaking a name kept the soul alive in the afterlife, this erasure meant total annihilation, no resurrection, no afterlife, no trace that you had ever existed. The process of erasure began immediately upon condemnation. Teams of workers would fan out across Egypt to every place the condemned person's name appeared. Every inscription would be chiseled away, every statue defaced, every papyrus burned. The thoroughness was extraordinary. Even tiny cartouches on scarab beetles would be ground smooth. The condemned person's name would become unspeakable, referred to only as the criminal or the enemy, if reference was absolutely necessary. Pharaoh Akhenaten faced this fate posthumously, his radical religious reforms earning him complete erasure after death. His capital city of Amarna was abandoned and demolished. His monuments were torn down and used as fill for other constructions. His name was chiseled from king lists, creating gaps in the royal succession that confused historians for centuries. Even his mummy was deliberately damaged to prevent resurrection, though recent discoveries suggest some priests secretly preserved it, unable to completely destroy a divine pharaoh. The female pharaoh Hatshepsut suffered partial erasure, though debate continues about whether this was punishment or political expedience. Her successor, Thutmose III, waited 20 years after her death to begin the erasure, suggesting complex motivations. Her images were chiseled away, but carefully. Often just her face was removed while leaving her body intact. Her name was erased from some monuments, but left on others. This selective erasure created a ghostly half-existence, neither fully remembered nor completely forgotten. The practical execution of damnatio memoriae required enormous resources. The great royal wife of Amenhotep III, Queen Ta, a different Ta from the conspirator, had her name appear on thousands of objects across Egypt and Nubia. When her grandson Tutankhamun reversed the Amarna revolution, every instance had to be found and destroyed. Teams of scribes worked for years, just cataloging locations where her name appeared. The cost of complete erasure often exceeded the cost of the original monuments. But erasure went beyond just removing names. The condemned person's family would be forced to participate in the erasure, publicly denying their relationship. Children would have to swear oaths that they had no parent by that name. Spouses would declare they had never been married. Friends would deny knowledge of the person's existence. This social erasure was often more painful than the physical destruction of monuments. The magical implications of erasure were carefully considered. Simply removing a name wasn't enough. The space where it had been had to be properly treated to prevent the name from somehow reforming. The chiseled areas would be filled with plaster mixed with execration texts, curses that would prevent the name from ever being restored. Some erasures involved carving different names over the removed ones, using the new name's power to suppress any spiritual remnants of the old. Public humiliation in ancient Egypt went far beyond simple embarrassment. It was a calculated destruction of social identity that rendered victims spiritually and socially dead while their bodies still functioned. The methods were sophisticated, combining physical exposure, ritual degradation, and community participation in ways that made recovery impossible. These weren't momentary punishments, but permanent transformations of a person's place in society and the cosmos. A woman named Amenirdis, caught in adultery with a temple guard, faced the full spectrum of public humiliation rituals. Her punishment began with the walking of shame, a procession through every district of Thebes that would last 3 days. But this wasn't simple exposure. Every aspect was designed for maximum degradation. She was stripped naked, her body painted with symbols that identified her crime in graphic detail. The hieroglyphs literally spelled out what she had done, where and with whom. Her hair, a symbol of feminine beauty and power, was shaved not with bronze razors but plucked out strand by strand by the wives of respected citizens. Each woman was required to pull at least one hair, making them active participants in the humiliation. The process took hours, with Amenirdis bound in the public square, while hundreds of women took turns. By the end, her scalp was bloody and scarred, ensuring that even if hair grew back, it would never be the same. The second day involved what court records call the marking of shame. Amenirdis was branded with symbols that would forever identify her as an adulteress. But these weren't simple brands. They were elaborate designs that covered much of her body. The iron was heated just enough to scar, but not enough to cauterize quickly, prolonging the agony. The brands were placed in locations that couldn't be hidden by clothing: forehead, cheeks, backs of hands. She would wear her crime on her skin for the rest of her life. On the third day came the reversal of status. Everything that had defined Amenirdis' social position was publicly destroyed or inverted. Her marriage contract was burned while she watched. Her dowry was distributed to beggars, who were encouraged to mock her as they received it. Her children were brought forward and forced to publicly disown her, declaring her not mother, in a ritual that severed maternal bonds. Her name was formally cursed by priests, making it dangerous for anyone to speak it aloud. The culmination of the humiliation ritual involved something court records describe only as the demonstration of worthlessness. While specific details were considered too profane to record, witness accounts suggest it involved Amenirdis being forced to perform degrading acts that demonstrated her complete loss of human dignity. She had to beg for scraps like an animal, crawl through streets on all fours, and submit to whatever humiliations passing citizens chose to inflict. But the humiliation didn't end with the 3-day ritual. Amanirdis would spend the rest of her life in a state of permanent shame. She was required to wear specific clothing that identified her as the shamed one. She couldn't enter temples, attend public festivals, or even shop in markets during normal hours. She had to live on the outskirts of society, surviving on whatever charity people chose to give, though giving too much charity to the shamed was itself considered suspicious. Men faced different, but equally destroying humiliation rituals. A tax collector named Senenmut, who had embezzled royal funds, was subjected to the unmaking of manhood. He was dressed in women's clothing and forced to perform traditional women's work in public, grinding grain, washing clothes, preparing food. But this wasn't simple gender reversal. Every action was exaggerated to mock both him and the activities themselves. He ground grain while citizens threw stones at him. He washed clothes in water that had been deliberately contaminated. He prepared food that would be fed to dogs while he watched, hungry. The involvement of children in humiliation rituals added another layer of cruelty. The children of the condemned were sometimes forced to participate in their parents' humiliation, throwing refuse, speaking condemnations, even inflicting physical punishments. This served multiple purposes. It severed family bonds, it implicated the next generation in the punishment, and it taught community values through forced participation in justice. The economic destruction that accompanied public humiliation was total. Not only was all property confiscated, but the condemned were forbidden from engaging in any trade or earning money through labor. They became completely dependent on charity, but accepting charity from the shamed was considered morally contaminating. This created a vicious cycle where survival required begging, but begging reinforced worthlessness. Some humiliation rituals involved forced consumption of substances that would mark the condemned from within. They might be forced to drink dyes that would color their urine and feces, making even their private bodily functions into public displays of shame. They might be fed foods that caused distinctive odors to emanate from their skin. Their bodies became walking announcements of their crimes. Beyond the crocodiles of Sobek, ancient Egypt employed various sacred animals as instruments of divine justice. Each animal was associated with specific gods and delivered death in ways that carried profound theological meaning. The selection of which animal would execute a criminal wasn't random, but carefully matched to the nature of their crime, creating a system where the method of death itself was a form of divine judgment. The sacred bulls of Apis were normally objects of veneration, treated as living gods and mummified after death with honors exceeding those of nobles. But in rare cases, they served as executioners for crimes against divine masculinity. A priest named Amenemheb, who had been caught castrating young boys for sale as eunuchs, was sentenced to death by bull. He was brought to the enclosure of the Apis bull in Memphis, painted with red ochre that would enrage the animal, and released into the arena. The death by sacred bull was theological justice. Someone who had destroyed masculinity would be destroyed by the ultimate symbol of masculine power. The bull's horns, penetrating the criminal's body, represented a violent restoration of the masculine principle that had been violated. The trampling hooves crushed the bones that had wielded the castrating knife. Every aspect of the death was interpreted as divine commentary on the crime. The sacred cobras, associated with the goddess Wadjet, served as executioners for crimes against royal authority. These weren't common snakes, but specially bred serpents whose venom had been cultivated for generations to be particularly agonizing. A governor named Kayamwaset, who had plotted against the pharaoh, was sentenced to the cobra's kiss. He was restrained in a seated position, his head held immobile, while a cobra was encouraged to strike his face repeatedly. The venom of the sacred cobras caused a specific type of death that priests interpreted as spiritually significant. First came paralysis, rendering the criminal unable to move but fully conscious. Then came the hallucinations, which priests claimed were visions of the crimes being punished. Finally came respiratory failure. but so slowly that the criminal had hours to contemplate their transgression while unable to speak or move. The entire process was observed and documented, with priests interpreting each symptom as divine judgment. Sacred scorpions, associated with the goddess Circuit, were used for crimes involving betrayal and hidden threats. The condemned would be placed in a pit filled with hundreds of scorpions that had been starved and agitated. But this wasn't random stinging. The scorpions were directed by handlers using special tools and sounds. They could concentrate the stings on specific body parts, creating patterns of pain that supposedly spelled out the criminal's guilt in a language of venom and swelling. The sacred ibises, birds associated with Thoth, god of wisdom and judgment, were used in a particularly disturbing form of execution for scribes who had forged documents. The condemned scribe would be staked out in the desert near ibis nesting grounds during breeding season. The territorial birds would attack the immobilized victim, pecking out eyes first, removing the ability to read, then tongue, removing the ability to speak lies, then slowly pecking away flesh while the victim lived. The order of consumption was interpreted as divine editing of a corrupted text. When criminals violated temples or sacred spaces, their punishments involved the deliberate corruption of their own spiritual essence. These weren't just executions, but ceremonies that transformed the criminal into a sort of spiritual poison that would contaminate everything they touched in the afterlife. The process required extensive ritual preparation to ensure the corruption was complete and permanent. A priestess named Tauret, who had stolen offerings from the inner sanctuary, faced this ultimate corruption. Her punishment began with forced consumption of substances that would pollute her from within. She drank water mixed with pig's blood, pigs being considered unclean animals whose essence would corrupt her spiritual purity. She ate bread made from grain that had been deliberately contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations and spiritual disorientation. Every meal for a month was designed to transform her from sacred servant to spiritual toxin. The actual execution took place in a specially constructed anti-temple, a structure that inverted every aspect of sacred architecture. Where temples faced east toward the rising sun, the anti-temple faced west toward death. Where temples were built on raised ground, the anti-temple was dug into the earth. Where temples used white limestone, the anti-temple used black granite. This inverted sacred space would become the site of Tauret's spiritual destruction. The rituals performed were deliberate inversions of temple ceremonies. Where priests would normally wash with sacred water, Tauret was washed with fluids from decomposing bodies. Where incense would normally be burned, she was surrounded by smoke from burning excrement. Where prayers would normally be chanted, curses were spoken. Every aspect of temple service was reversed, corrupting her priestly training and making her knowledge of sacred rituals into a source of torment. The method of death itself was designed to corrupt her spiritual essence permanently. She was slowly poisoned with a mixture that included metals that wouldn't leave her body after death: lead, mercury, and antimony that would make her corpse toxic to touch. Even in death, she would contaminate anything near her. Her body couldn't be mummified, as the poisons would destroy the natron. She couldn't be burned, as the smoke would spread contamination. She could only be sealed in lead and buried in cursed ground. During certain religious festivals, multiple executions were orchestrated as elaborate theatrical performances that told moral stories through synchronized suffering. These punishment feasts combined entertainment, education, and execution into spectacles that could involve dozens of criminals dying in choreographed sequences that illustrated theological principles through their collective agony. The Festival of Osiris's Vengeance was one such event, held annually to commemorate the god's triumph over chaos. Criminals condemned to death during the year would be saved for this festival, where their executions would recreate mythological battles. A group of tomb robbers would play the role of Seth's army, while their execution would represent Osiris's victory. But this wasn't simple killing. It was elaborate theater, where the method and timing of each death contributed to the narrative. The criminals were prepared for weeks before the festival, trained in their roles like actors in a deadly play. They learned specific movements, particular positions to assume when wounded, even lines to speak at crucial moments. They were costumed to represent mythological figures, their faces painted to look like demons or enemies of order. Some were given props, weapons they couldn't actually use, shields that wouldn't protect them, armor that was deliberately weakened at crucial points. The performance began at dawn and continued until sunset, with different acts showing different aspects of the myth. In the morning, criminals representing chaos would seem to triumph, actually defeating and killing criminals representing lesser forces of order. This wasn't mercy. Those playing chaos forces knew they would face worse deaths in the afternoon when order reasserted itself. The audience would boo and hiss at chaos's temporary victory, building anticipation for divine justice. By noon, the tide would turn. Priests dressed as gods would enter the performance space, and the real executions would begin. But every death had to match its mythological counterpart. A criminal representing the chaos serpent Apophis would be slowly cut into pieces, each cut corresponding to a segment of the divine snake. A criminal representing a demon of drought would be slowly dehydrated to death in the Sunday. The synchronization of multiple executions to tell a coherent story required extensive planning and precise timing. The audience participation was mandatory and structured. At specific moments, they would throw objects at the criminals, not randomly, but in choreographed waves that represented divine forces attacking chaos. Children would throw flowers at criminals about to die, blessing them into death. Women would ululate at moments of divine victory. Men would stamp their feet to represent earthquakes of divine wrath. The entire community became part of the performance. While children were generally protected in Egyptian society, those born into condemned families or showing early signs of corruption faced punishments designed to prevent them from growing into greater threats. These punishments balanced the Egyptian reverence for innocence with their fear of inherited evil, creating systems of justice that would horrify modern sensibilities but made perfect sense within Egyptian theology. Children of executed traitors faced partial existence punishments. They weren't killed, that would be wasteful, but they were marked and limited in ways that prevented them from ever achieving full personhood. Their foreheads were branded with symbols identifying them as seeds of corruption. They were forbidden from learning to write, ensuring they could never hold positions of power. They were sterilized to prevent them from passing on their corrupt bloodline. They existed but were prevented from fully living. Some children faced punishment for their own crimes, particularly those who showed what priests interpreted as supernatural evil. A boy named Seneb, who at age 7 was caught torturing animals in ways that suggested demonic possession, was subjected to spiritual binding. This involved rituals that supposedly trapped evil spirits within his body, preventing them from spreading, but also preventing him from ever developing normally. He was kept in temple custody, studied by priests who documented the progression of evil within him while ensuring it couldn't escape. The children of temple prostitutes occupied a complex position that often resulted in institutional punishment. They were considered spiritually contaminated by their conception during sacred but impure acts. These children were raised in temple compounds but forbidden from entering sacred spaces. They were educated but only in practical skills, never in religious knowledge. They were fed but given food that had been rejected from offerings. They existed within temple society but were permanently excluded from its sacred aspects. As we reach the end of this catalog of horrors, it becomes clear that ancient Egyptian punishment was never simply about justice. It was about the total integration of punishment into religious, social, and cosmic order. Every mutilation, every execution, every humiliation served multiple purposes: removing threats, enforcing conformity, entertaining masses, appeasing gods, and maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos that Egyptians believed kept the universe functioning. The sophistication of these punishments reveals a civilization that had thought deeply about the nature of suffering, identity, and existence itself. They understood that death was just one form of ending, and often not the worst. They recognized that the human spirit could be broken in ways that transcended physical pain. They discovered that communities could be bound together through shared participation in atrocity, that horror could become normalized through repetition and ritual structure. The priests who administered these punishments weren't sadists. They were theologians who genuinely believed that these extremes were necessary for cosmic balance. The crowds who watched weren't simply bloodthirsty. They were participants in religious ceremonies that they believed protected their society from chaos. The victims themselves often accepted their punishments as divine justice, their own worldview so shaped by Egyptian theology that they couldn't conceive of their suffering as anything but deserved. What's most disturbing about Egyptian punishment is not its brutality. Many cultures have been brutal, but its integration into every aspect of society. Children grew up watching divine crocodiles consume criminals. Families participated in the erasure of their own relatives. Communities gathered to watch synchronized executions that told religious stories through coordinated death. This wasn't aberrant behavior, but normal, celebrated, essential aspects of Egyptian life. The legacy of these punishments extends far beyond ancient Egypt. The Romans adopted and refined many Egyptian punishment methods, particularly the use of spectacle and theater in execution. Medieval Christianity incorporated Egyptian concepts of spiritual corruption and bodily integrity into its own punishment theology. Even modern states echo Egyptian practices in their use of public humiliation, social death, and the destruction of identity as forms of punishment that extend beyond simple incarceration. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the Egyptian discovery that human beings can normalize absolutely anything if it's properly framed within religious and social structures. The same civilization that created magnificent art, pioneering medicine, and sophisticated philosophy also created systematic horrors that challenge our conception of human capacity for cruelty. They showed that refinement and brutality aren't opposites, but can coexist, even reinforce each other. The records of these punishments, preserved in papyri and stone, weren't hidden or shameful to the Egyptians. They were proud documentation of divine justice properly administered. The judicial papyrus of Turin, our main source for the harem conspiracy punishments, was carefully preserved as a model of how justice should function. The execution stelae that recorded public punishments were displayed prominently, celebrating the maintenance of order through calculated horror. Modern Egyptology has sometimes struggled with how to present these aspects of ancient Egyptian culture. The focus on pyramids, mummies, and golden treasures is partly because these are more palatable than the reality of systematic torture, public humiliation, and spiritual annihilation that were equally part of Egyptian civilization. We want to admire the ancients for their achievements without confronting the prices paid for their conception of order. Yet, understanding these punishments is essential for truly comprehending ancient Egyptian society. Their concepts of justice, divinity, and human nature are revealed more clearly in how they punished transgression than in how they rewarded conformity. The extremes they were willing to embrace in the name of order show the depths of their commitment to their worldview. The sophistication of their cruelty reveals the complexity of their theology. The individuals who suffered these punishments, Khaim-Waset fed to crocodiles, Amenhotep castrated for sacrilege, Ta erased from existence, weren't simply victims, but participants in a cosmic drama that Egyptian society believed was essential for survival. Their suffering wasn't meaningless, but was transformed through ritual and interpretation into divine communication, social education, and cosmic rebalancing. As we close this exploration of ancient Egyptian punishment, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the nature of civilization itself. Does refinement in culture necessarily lead to refinement in cruelty? Does the complexity of society require equally complex forms of punishment? Does the human capacity for normalizing horror have limits, or can any atrocity become acceptable if properly integrated into social and religious structures? The ancient Egyptians provide no comfortable answers, only evidence that human beings are capable of extraordinary extremes in both creation and destruction. They built monuments that have lasted millennia and created tortures that destroyed souls for eternity. They preserved bodies with reverent care and fed others to sacred crocodiles. They wrote love poetry of touching beauty and documentation of synchronized executions performed as religious theater. This duality isn't contradiction, but completion. Two aspects of the same sophisticated civilization that understood human nature in all its potential for transcendence and degradation. The punishments of ancient Egypt remind us that the distance between civilization and savagery isn't measured in time or technology, but in the stories societies tell themselves about why certain horrors are necessary. The sacred lakes where crocodiles once delivered divine justice are now tourist attractions. The mines where countless criminals were worked to death produce copper for modern electronics. The tombs where servants were buried alive have been excavated, and their contents displayed in museums. The physical spaces of punishment have been transformed or destroyed, but the human capacity that created them remains unchanged. In the end, the most horrific aspect of ancient Egyptian punishment might not be the methods themselves, but the revelation of what human beings can accept, celebrate, and institutionalize when horror is dressed in the clothes of justice, wrapped in the authority of religion, and normalized through repetition. The ancient Egyptians showed us depths of organized cruelty that challenge our assumptions about progress and civilization. Their punishments echo through history, reminding us that every society creates its own forms of necessary horror, its own systems for destroying those who threaten order, its own methods for transforming individual suffering into collective meaning. The crocodiles may no longer be sacred, the brands may no longer be physical, the erasures may be digital rather than chiseled, but the impulse to punish, humiliate, and destroy in the name of order remains constant. Ancient Egypt gave us mathematics, medicine, and monumental architecture. It also gave us sophisticated templates for systematic cruelty that transformed punishment into art, suffering into spectacle, and horror into holiness. Both legacies persist, intertwined, and inseparable, reminding us that human civilization has always been built on foundations that include both transcendent achievement and calculated atrocity. The punishments have ended, the capacity remains. The horror endures in the human potential for transforming cruelty into culture, brutality into beauty, and suffering into the sacred. This is the complete truth about the most horrific punishment methods of ancient Egypt, not just what they did, but what it reveals about what human beings can do when horror becomes institutionalized, theologized, and normalized. The ancient Egyptians didn't invent cruelty, but they refined it into forms that challenge our understanding of both civilization and savagery. Their legacy lives on, not in the specific methods, but in the recognition that any society can create elaborate justifications for elaborate horrors. The distance between us and them isn't as great as we might hope. We've simply developed different stories about why certain sufferings are necessary, different rituals for implementing justice, different ways of normalizing what should be unthinkable. The sacred crocodiles are gone, but somewhere, in some form, the feeding continues. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.